To week 10, mobile web applications. So last week we covered React.js. We introduced what React.js was, and it's basically an extension of the JavaScript library. And we can use React as a building block on top of that to build components or modules in our code to make it a lot more efficient in, taking something like that to-do list and duplicating the to-do items. So in order to understand React apps, we need to understand because that is on. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have a little bit of a refresher on JavaScript, and yeah, let's dive right into it. So React apps are typically built with the latest version of JavaScript, and they use what's called next-gen features. So next-gen features would be all the things we're covering today, but there's ES5 JavaScript and then there's ES6. And the next-gen features I'm talking about are ES6 features. And they allow us to write clean and robust React apps. Cool. So React itself uses a lot of next-generation JavaScript features. I'm just getting my cursor highlighter working here. There we go. You should be able to see that now so you can see my mouse a little easier. It uses a lot of next-gen JavaScript features. Therefore, it's really important for you to understand all the features and not be confused by some of the weird things or really strange-looking versions of JavaScript that you might not recognize. So you might know JavaScript, but you might not recognize next-gen JavaScript. So it's really important for you to kind of get a refresher on some of these things. So that's what this little PowerPoint is about here. If you haven't worked with ES6 or any other version of JavaScript, hopefully it'll be a little bit of a refresher. So starting with some keywords, let and const, you'll see these a lot. And if you've used JavaScript in the past, you'll recognize the first word there in purple, which is var. Var obviously is how we used to create a variable. That's totally changed now. So in ES6, next-gen JavaScript, let replaces var. So let will allow us to create a variable that changes and has different variables. Whereas const is also a new keyword, and that creates a variable that never changes. Just like any other language, C++, if you have a const, it's a constant value. And so you'll never see when using React.js, actually, you'll only see let. So it's the new var. And we will actually mainly use const quite a bit because we don't want our const to change. So you'll see const quite a bit as well. So just thought you should know those keywords off the bat. So just to get a quick look at, var, let, and const, let's go to jsbin.com and we'll just do this little example right here. Cool. So I've got JSBin open on my other monitor here. I'll just drag it over, and you can open it up in your browser as you're following along in the video or as you're following along in the lecture. And you have to make sure that you turn on the console and JavaScript. So when you first load the page, for some reason, there it is. Mine wasn't showing up here. You'll have HTML enabled, and you'll probably have output enabled. Turn off output, turn on console, turn off HTML, and then turn on JavaScript here. All right. So we've got an empty development environment here with JavaScript, and we can run stuff into the console. You can obviously just use the developer console, but this is a little easier. So let's try the old, oops, what is happening here? Let's try the old version. Let's create a var, and we'll do my name equals, and then in single quotes, Ben. And that's my name. And then I'll just do a console.log my name. Obviously, if we run this, we expect to get my name. And there it is, Ben. Now, if I update my name, and I say it's equal to Benjamin, because now I've down here. Now let's see what happens. So it prints Ben and then Benjamin. Actually, I'll clear it and run it. Ben and then Benjamin. Awesome. So now let's try it with the new version. Instead of var, let's use the keyword let. Okay, so let my name equal Ben, and then we'll update it to Benjamin again. So I'll clear it, run it, and exact same output, right? kind of what we expected. So there's the similarities between var and let. Notice if we do a const here, okay, and now I'm setting this my name variable to Ben as a constant. If I run this, notice the console error, assignment to constant variable, because here I'm trying to assign a new value to a constant variable, and constant variables can't change. That's in their nature. So there's no new values ever allowed, and that's why we get a console error. Very good. So the next thing I want to talk about is arrow functions. Arrow functions is a different syntax for creating JavaScript functions. So an arrow function is stored in a constant here in this example in orange, where in the purple, that's the old version of creating a function. So you might be used to function, then the function name, then the parameters it expects, and then curly braces with the logic inside. Well, arrow functions actually is you can store your function in a variable or a constant and then give it a name equals. And if there's no parameters, you just do the empty brackets and there's your arrow right after, right here, which is why we call it an arrow function. And then we pass it in our logic in the curly braces. On the right side of the equal sign is the arrow function and a list of arguments here, which is empty. The arrow and then the keyword. No more issues with the this keyword in JavaScript. That's the huge benefit to using arrow functions. So we used to use the this keyword a lot, like this dot whatever, this dot whatever. But the problem is it doesn't always refer what you want it to refer to because the context sometimes gets lost. So by using arrow functions, we actually avoid the context issues of the this keyword, and we don't have to have any more of those problems because now it knows the scope of what is inside of its function. Cool. So let's do a little example of that now. So I've got this code here for later reference, but we'll do a live version of it, and I'll just delete my name code, and we'll create a new function called print my name. And I'll create a variable here called name. Not a variable, sorry, a parameter that the function will expect as input, and we'll console.log name. So when I call that function print my name, and I pass it the value Ben, we should expect that console.log outputs my name Ben, which it does. Okay, so that's all pretty normal. So now let's try doing arrow function syntax. So here I'm going to store the function in a variable const called print my name, but I don't need to use the function keyword. Then I can do the equal sign and the variable that it expects as input or the parameter, my arrow sign syntax, and then my curly braces. Now in here I can do this console.log and that line, and if I call print my name again and pass it Benjamin, yeah.
No, I was just saying, I was not updating what you were typing, but now it's done. Sorry, we're lagging behind.
Sorry. Yes, apparently my internet's been a little bit laggy today, so my thing might cut out for a couple seconds. It hasn't fully cut out yet, but hopefully that doesn't happen. Okay, so here's the old syntax, and I'll just do that in some comments here. And here's arrow function syntax. And notice there's our arrow, okay? Now, I don't know if this will actually, I'll just call this function something different so that we don't run into conflict. Clear that, and look, I get Ben, and then the arrow function works the exact same way. Instead of using the function keyword, we store it in a const. You don't have to store it in a const, you can store it in a let. And then that's only if you ever want the function name to change, obviously. We usually don't want our function names to change, so print my name too, you know, we can just store it in a const. That's pretty normal, that's what you'll usually see. and then we pass in one parameter. So there's one more example that I want to show you, which is, again, it's going to be in its arrow function syntax with additional options. And this just might be code that you see online, so it's good for you to know. I should also zoom this in a little bit so it's easier for you to see. So this one, it's going to be the exact same as print my name too. I'll call it print my name. What's cool is if your function only has one argument and only one argument, then, so here's our argument here, name. If it has one argument and only one argument, we can omit these curly braces, okay? So I can actually do this, which just saves me a little bit of time. Then I do my arrow, and then I can get into my function, which maybe would be, let's say it's like, I'm actually going to use a different example. Instead of print my name, I'll call this function multiply. This is the same example that's on the PowerPoint. And let's say we pass it in one parameter, which is number, okay? Okay, so then in here, if we wanted to return a number multiplied by a value of 2, and the only job of our function was to return a statement, then you can actually also omit these curly braces and put the return statement all on the same line and write your function in one line of code. And we can put it all on one line, and we can omit the keyword return. So it actually can get a lot shorter. So watch this. If I do this, console.log multiply, so I'm calling the multiply function, and it expects one parameter, so I'm going to pass it 2, okay? And then obviously it's going to pass in 2 here, and then do 2 times 2 and return 4. So if I run this, there I get 4. But another option for arrow function syntax, if the only job of your function is to return a statement, then we can omit the curly braces, we can put this braces are gone, and we can also keyword return, all right? And then you just have your arrow function and then what it's returning. And then when we console.log, we do this again, look, there it is, it still works. Now, a key thing to note with the parameters, okay, because we're omitting these brackets. If you have 2 parameters, you have to have, like if you had number and num2 that you passed in as arguments, then you have to have the curly brackets. Sorry, you have to have brackets. Now, if you have no parameters, you also have to have the brackets. So it's only if you have one parameter or one argument, you can omit the brackets. Okay, so just letting you know, just so if you see some code that's ES6 and there's no brackets, you're not confused. Okay, that's why. Cool, we'll clear that. That's the example that's here on the PowerPoint. If you want to run it, you can run it. If you want to do it while we're in class, follow along, then that's great too. The next gen feature that I want to talk to you about in JavaScript that you'll probably see is about writing modular code. So exports and imports. You may have seen these and heard of them. The idea behind import and export statements
I have a question.
is, yeah.
What if you want to store the value returned by a method, by function? So how will we do that? We will say variable equal to this thing, and we don't have to specify a return type, I'm assuming.
So sorry, if I wanted to return,
you're returning a number and you want to store it in a variable for additional use.
Oh, so then you'd go like something like that.
Okay.
And then I would do something like this. So then what happens is I'm saying let favnum. So I'm creating a new variable here, and I'm setting it equal to, oops, I didn't call my function correctly. this function, multiply, and I'm passing in the argument 2, which is going to come here. 2 times 2 is going to get returned. So then this is going to be 4. This whole statement evaluates to 4. So I'm saying let favnum equal 4. And then basically here I'm going to do console.log favnum, which is going to be this variable, which is 4. So let's run this. There we go.
Okay, so like the old version, we do not specify any return type in the function.
In the old version, you could return stuff, like if you were going to use the keyword return.
But we never specified a return type, right? Like in other
Oh,
languages.
at the top, like up here, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not like that. It's a little
The
bit different with
const,
JavaScript.
yeah, the
Yeah,
const actually confused me. The const multiply
so yeah,
confused
the
me.
const is not, that's a good point. The const is not the return type of this function. The const is actually saving this function in a variable name called multiply. So we don't use the function keyword anymore. And it's unlike Java, where Java, if you wanted to return an int, you would do like public int and then your function name, because then you're declaring your return type as a public int, and then at the end it's expecting to return an int. Here, if you want to return something, you just return it. So JavaScript's a little bit of a looser typed or weaker typed language than some of those other languages.
So in Python, we can actually send functions as variables. We can treat functions as variables. Is that the same case over here? That's why we have a const multiply, that we can treat and send functions as objects or variables to one another.
Yeah, so you'll see in a little bit, actually, I'm going to cover something called, oh shoot, I'm gonna cover something about that in actually like a couple of slides where you can actually um, unpack a function or an object and treat them the same way and add properties to them. So you can release them, or if you wanted to unpack an object's properties and then add a property to it dynamically, you could do that. So you'll see that that's kind of where this will come into play in a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. But more so, think about this now is instead of using the function keyword, we're using the const keyword so that this name of the function won't change. But yeah, you can think of it like we're storing it in a variable name. But if I were to do like console.log multiply, it's not going to print out like the variable name, because the variable itself is returning something. So it's just going to print out 4, right? So if I clear this and I run this again, oh, I have to pass it something, obviously, or else it'll just return the statement it's meant to return. There we go. And there's 4. Right now I'm not using favnum anymore, so
Okay, thank you.
hopefully that helps. Yeah. All right, so exports and imports. The idea behind export and import statements inside of a JavaScript file, so you may have seen something like this inside of it. We have a person object, okay, and they have the property key name value pair name max, and then they export default person. Okay, the key idea behind this is basically inside a JS file, we can import content from another file, so the JS files themselves know their dependencies. So manually, we can allow the HTML, the index.html, to kind of understand what dependencies there are with JavaScript in our import statements that way. Like at the head of an index.html file, we typically can control, import main.js, import all of our different script files, and we can choose the order that we import them in. But we can also allow our JavaScript files to understand their dependencies within each other by using these import and export statements, if you think about it like that. So the keyword default here, export default person, it basically allows us to name, when we import it into another file, app.js here, we can name it whatever we want during the import process. So here I'm importing person from ./person.js, which is my file name, into my app.js file. But you can see I also can complete the same logic, but then I can call it import PRS from ./person. Because this is a default export and it's the only thing the person.js file exports, I don't need to use a specific name when I import it into a file because it already knows if it's a default export, it's the only import that's going to be coming in. So I can call it whatever variable name I want. All right, now in utility.js, we have two things we're exporting. So you can't just do a default for multiple because a default can only apply to one. So here I'm exporting two things. I'm exporting a constant called clean, and that's a function. And I'm exporting a constant called base data equal to 10. So here, what's going to happen is when I import it from utility.js, I have to specify the name that I'm wanting to import into. So if I want to import base data, I have to use the curly braces and use the same name as from utility.js. Okay. So here we can export it with a custom name and not the default keyword, but then when we import it, we have to use the same name we exported it with. All right. Now, all of these next-gen JavaScript features won't run automatically in all browsers. We need to set up our project to compile these features into older JS sometimes. So I'll show you a little bit what I mean by that, and you'll see when I change one of my language selections in JS bin on the console we've been using. But I'm just going to talk a little bit more about exporting and importing before that. So here, we've got another kind of way to look at exporting and importing. So here I'm importing person from /person.js, but I can also import the same object from person.js and save it in the PRS variable because it was a default just like before. It was a default export. Okay, now another option about what we can do is we can use the as keyword. So from utility.js, we could import our specific SEH, but we can also give it an alias when we use the as keyword here, like the second line. We still have to put it in curly braces and use the exact same naming convention that we used in the export from utility.js, but then we can rename the alias that we want to use as SMTH in our app.js or whichever file we're importing it into. So here I used as SMTH, so it's obviously just going to be using the same name just with a capital S. Or if I actually export a bunch of things, so like in the previous slide where I had const clean and const base data, I can import all of these items in one import statement using the star keyword and then use an alias as bundled from utility.js. Then I can access either one of these properties by doing bundled.basedata or bundled.clean and access it almost like a property in a class from this alias, bundled dot, and then whichever property I'm trying to access. So basically, the asterisks will import them as a JSON object, and then we can access those JSON objects properties to get access to all of the exports within that JSON object. All right, so that's imports and exports. And kind of similar to imports and exports is classes. So you may have used classes before in JavaScript or just maybe in Java. And classes basically are blueprints for objects or templates for objects. So you make a class and it holds all of the information that you would want to hold when or if. So here we have a class called person, and it's going to be a template that obviously contains all the information we'd ever want to know about a person if we were to ever create a person. So obviously we'd want to know the name, we'd want to know gender, we'd want to know whatever. And then when we actually create an object of that class or an instance of that class, then we would fill in those values like name, gender, etc. So we have to use the class keyword, obviously, to create a class, and then they can have properties and methods inside of them. So this person class here has a property called name with a value of max, but it can also have a method in it that's called call that expects no parameters with an arrow function and then some logic in here. So I could do person.call. So if we were to ever make an object of this class, we instantiate it with something called the new keyword right here. And the new keyword actually allows us to create an object out of the class. So here we have const myPerson, which is going to be the object that I'm creating, equals new person. So it's going to take all of the properties and methods from the person class right here and put them into my new variable called const myPerson. I can then access the methods and properties inside of that object by doing myPerson.call, which is the method right here, or I can actually access the properties as well by doing myPerson.name, which is this property up here. We'll also talk a little bit about inheritance, and a class that you inherit from basically takes all of its properties and methods on top of the class you're inheriting from. And I'll show you an example when we do some live code in the next slide. But here I have a class person, and we use the keyword extends to extend master class. Whichever properties and properties and methods come from the master class will now be included in my person class. So let's do a little example and write some JavaScript in our browser, and you guys can follow along as we go. So I'll delete this, and let's make a class. So I'm going to do a class called human. And in my class called human, I'll open up with my curly braces. And then we need to do something called a constructor. A constructor is basically a default function that instantiates the class. So you have to include it. If you don't include it, your class won't operate correctly. Then we can put all of our properties inside of this constructor by using the this keyword. So let's give this property a name, this dot, oh, you know what? I'm doing this a little bit. I don't want to create a class called human. I want to create a class called person because I'm going to make a class called human later and inherit from it. So let's create a class called person. And inside of a person will have a name. Okay? This dot name equals, and for me, I'm going to use my name, Ben, and set a default value to Ben. All right, so now what we've done is we've given it a property, and then we're also going to add a function inside of this class that's going to print the name. So I can make, and then what we'll do is inside of the function logic, console.log, this.name. So what would happen is it knows this in the context is this value for this dot name. Do you have a question?
No, nothing. Sorry.
So that's it for this function, or sorry, this class, should I say. So now what I want to do is create a new object of this class or a template of this class. So this is my template. It doesn't do anything. If I were to print off person, nothing would happen. But I want to create an object out of this class, and I want to use create it into a person variable using the new keyword. So I'm going to create a const called person equals, and I'm going to use the new keyword here, new person. And here's where I'm calling my class to get the template or blueprint code. And it's going to take all of those properties and apply them to my person variable from that new object. And then here I can do person dot, and I can actually access the function inside my print my name. And now it'll call this code, print my name, up here because person has all of the properties and methods from this class. So let's run this. Oops. And there it is. We printed our name. Awesome. Okay, so now what we want to do is let's create a class to inherit from. So I'm going to enter and do a couple of lines. And I'm going to add a class called human. Okay? And in my class called human, same thing. I need a constructor or else it won't operate correctly. And in my constructor, I'm going to add something that this dot gender equals, and this will be male. All right. And then we can, after our constructor, we can make another function called print gender. And in the print gender function, we'll do console.log this dot gender. All right. So now we've got another class called human, but we need to make our person class extend this class by using the extends keywords. So after class person, I'm going to write extends human. Awesome. Now, what's happening here is I've got a property in my constructor, right? And it's going to also inherit this property from the human class because the person class is inheriting all of the traits from the human class. It's the parent. So it will have name and gender. So functions, methods, and properties will all get passed down from the parent to the child. Now, if I run this, you'll see I'll get an error. You must call the superconstructor in the derived class. So what that means is in order for my person to actually extend my human, this constructor needs to get run before this constructor. So we actually need to call something called super as one of the things in the constructor, which is going to run the super using the super keyword, and that runs the parent's constructor to first properly initialize the entire parent class so that we can have access to the rest of those properties and methods in our person class. Okay, so now we should be able to go something like this. So down here, I've got an instance or an object of my person class. Here's my person class, which extends human. So if I take my person variable and I do person dot, I should be able to do person dot print gender, and that should call a method that's in the human class. Even though it's coming from person equals new person, I have access to it because my person extends human up here. So let's run it. And look, there we go. It updated. So classes are really important because we use classes in React to create all of the components that we're going to create. And remember, they're just blueprints for JavaScript objects. So nothing to be scared of there. Hopefully classes, that makes a little bit more sense. So talking a little bit more about classes, properties, and functions. In next-gen JavaScript, okay, we can actually skip the constructor function call. So I just showed you how to make classes and you had to use the constructor function call and all of that stuff. Well, you're going to see now in ES7, okay, which is next-gen JavaScript down here, you don't actually equals value like that. Same thing with methods or functions. So we have properties and then we also have methods. My method, okay, can now be stored in a variable because we have the equals sign here and use the arrow function syntax, okay? So we can skip a constructor function call, and same thing with methods. The next gen JavaScript way, we can think of a method as a property, which stores a function as a value, okay? And basically, then you end up with my method equals, just like over here we have my property equals. So you can kind of think of them like both properties. The advantage of this is we can use the arrow functions with no issues with the this keyword now, all right? So we can avoid using the this keyword here, and now that we have arrow functions here, we won't have as many issues with the this keyword if you've ever experienced that with JavaScript before. So here's a little example of the project we just made with class human constructor this.gender equals male. How it would look in ES6 or Babel is class human gender equals male. So I'm going to show you and walk you through it a little bit as we go through. But basically, we delete the red and we add the green. Okay. So I'm going to go to my console here, and we're just going to edit this. The first step is we have to change JavaScript drop down here to ES6 Babel. Okay, so that's going to allow us to use some of the next gen features from JavaScript. Now, a couple of things will still show as errors in the JS bin compiler. That's just because of the way their environment's set up, but it's actually still the proper way to write the new syntax, and you'll see what I mean in a little bit. So the first step with what we can do with ES7 are there, and as well as in the person class. All right. The next thing we can do is, because we deleted our constructor call, we can also delete our call to super, because we don't need to call our constructors anymore. So we've deleted our call to the super. We also learned that you can delete the call to the this keyword. So I don't need this dot name or this dot gender. And so now I'm just left with name equals Ben and gender equals male. I also don't need, well, actually, we'll just leave this for now because I want to see what happens if I get rid of that. Okay, so now it should look like class human, gender male, print gender. We realize we have to turn this into an arrow function. So print gender equals, and then after our empty argument list, we have our arrow. Okay, that was pretty easy. Console.log this.gender. There we go. Class person extends human. Name Ben. Now down here, I can actually change the gender to be female and update it here in this person class, and we'll see what that does in a little bit. And then the print my name function, I also can convert to an arrow function. That console.log this.name. So person.printmyname, person.print gender. We got Ben male last time. I'm going to clear that and run it. And look, we get Ben and female now, because I'm actually able to update my properties from the person class, even though they were assigned in the human class. And then it will still keep the default value up here. You're just able to access these values and properties now that we've inherited from human. So that's the ES6 Babel way of doing it without having to call the constructor and including arrow functions instead of the old functions. So hopefully that helps. All right, now I know you had a little question earlier about unpacking functions and functions being stored as variables. So we're going to talk about that a little bit with something called the spread and the rest operators. And you're going to see these all the time in React. So it's good to know what they do. Don't worry if it's confusing. It is a little bit confusing. And don't worry if you don't fully understand it, because we'll still explain it as we go and build throughout this next little bit of the course, building our React websites and web apps. I'm just trying to get you to understand the broad scope of what they do and how they work. So these new operators, spread and rest, they are both represented with the same symbol, and that's the 3 dots right here, dot, dot, dot. Okay? So we already can use these today in our React projects. But let's look a little bit at what they do. So the spread operator, when it's used on an array, okay, dot, 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 what it does is it splits up the array elements, or we can use it on an object as well, and it splits up the object properties. So this may look a little bit confusing, dot, 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 old array, and then 1 and then 2. But what that's doing is it's going to take the old array, whatever the old array is, maybe it's 199, 98. It's going to unpack them into individual 28, and then it's going to add 2 more elements, 1 and then 2. And now you have an array of 5. If you didn't unpack that array, then you would have an array, and then the first element itself would be an array of 3 elements with 198, 97, or whatever I said. And then your second element would be 1, and your third element would be 2. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a little bit in live code. Okay, and then the next operator is the rest operator. Or sorry, before I get to the rest operator, the spread operator can also be used on objects. So if an object had many properties, we could simply pull out our old object's properties and then add a new property with a value of 5 on top of those old properties instead of overwriting them. Now, if we did have a property with the same name in our old object, it would overwrite it here because it takes precedence. So it actually pulls out all the properties of the old object and their values and adds them as key value pairs to the new object. So our old property takes precedence. So this is the spread operator, okay? The rest operator is used to merge a list of function arguments into an array. All right, so that may sound a little bit confusing, but we use it in a function argument list. So sort args in this example here, function sort args, receives 1 argument, okay? And it actually is receiving an unlimited amount of arguments because it has the dot, dot, dot in front of it. So you could pass it 1, 2, 3, or however many you want, and then all we're writing is dot, dot, dot args, but we can actually receive or pass as many arguments as we want, and then they'll be merged into an array. And we use it. Then to our argument list, or whatever we want to do inside of this function logic, which is really helpful because then you don't have to dynamically create a vector and then pass in a vector and take out a vector or an array list or something like that. You can just do dot, dot, dot args, pass it however many things you want, and then it automatically gives you array functions or methods on top of it. So let's take a look at this in live code, okay? So here, we're going to unpack this. I'm going to delete all my old code. We're going to stay in ES6 Babel now, and we're going to make an array called const numbers. So I'm going to have 3, 1, 2, and 3 inside of my array, and then I'm going to make a new array called new numbers. And look at this. Here's my array. I do numbers and 4. So let's see. What do you guys think would happen if I do console.log new numbers? What do you guys think would happen here? Is it going to print 1, 2, 3, 4 all in square brackets like this? Or is it going to print 1, 2, 3, and then 4, but really there's only 1 and 2 elements in this array, but it's an array in an array? What do you think is going to happen if I print this out?
I think the latter.
Think the latter?
Yes,
Yeah,
I think so.
You're correct. Very good. That's smart. So yes, basically it didn't unpack our array. It just input these square brackets into here. And you actually end arrays inside of arrays. So this is where we can use the spread operator, okay, and actually unpack that array inside of this array, and it will actually if I clear this and run it, it'll actually separate the 1, the 2, and the 3 into their own individual elements. So you can see how this would be really handy, because how often have you had problems where you have arrays and arrays and you're like, oh, I need each of them to be individual elements. How do I spread them out into their own elements? So that's what the spread operator is useful for. We can also use this on properties to an object to safely copy all the old object's properties. So I'll show you that next. So here we are going to make a object called person. So const person equals, and then name Ben. So that's just a JSON object. Okay, so I didn't create a class and then an object of a class. I just created a JSON object. And I'm also going to create a const called new person. All right, and then inside of new person, I'm going to take my person object, and then I'm going to add a property called age 26. All right, so it was just my birthday, and we want to put my age in there. Now, if I do console.log new person, what do you think we're going to get printed out? It's going to show it in JavaScript object notation, so it's going to look a little bit funky. It'll print out the object, and then it'll print out the properties, but are we going to have an object within? We're going to just have properties and Ben age 26. What do you think?
Can you repeat the question? Cut off actually, sorry.
So if I do this, so I've got my person object here, and it's got a property name called name, all right? And the value of name is Ben. If I add my person object right here, okay, am I going to get person equals, and then it's going to say, you know, name equal Ben, age equal 26, because that's what I want? Or is it going to do this, but then inside of here, it's going to go person equals, and then I'm going to have an object within an object. And it's like,
I think the second one, yeah, object and object.
Right. Yeah, no, you're totally right. So that's what we don't want to happen. Here we've got a person, object, object within an object of object. So here, if I just use my spread operator again, 1, 2, 3, okay, and I run it, look at that. Now we only have one object, and they have the key name value pair age and name in the same context, the same scope, right? So it just combined them. And that's why that 3 dots, that spread operator, is really powerful. Now let's take a look at the rest operator. So the rest operator is the same syntax, it's ... but what it allows us to do is receive as many arguments as we want and then use array functions on them automatically without having to convert whatever we passed into a function into an array. So keep in mind here the dots are used so we can use a method like filter that automatically applies to arrays in JavaScript. So filter is not a method that I've made, it's a method that already exists. And the filter method, we don't have to really understand how it works here, but it's just going to filter through all of the items in an array. That's how it works in JavaScript, and it will execute the function on every element that's passed into the array. So let's take a look at live code here, what that would look like. So here I'm going to use the rest operator, not the spread operator. So here I've got a function that I'm creating. It expects something called args, right? And I've used the rest operator ... So it's going to convert whatever I pass into there, and I could pass multiple items. It's going to convert them all into an array. Now I don't know what would happen if you passed in like ints and strings, because it would probably just put them in like JavaScript notation, object notation. I'm not sure. Anyways, so let's say we've got a function here and it just returns args, which is our array now that it's creating. And we can use the filter function that comes with JavaScript. And I'm just going to take each element and say if the element equals 1, we're going to return it. So I'm using my triple equals. You don't have to worry about that, like exactly everything that's happening here. All you have to understand, okay, if this looks confusing to you, is when I call this, this function here, I'm just going to call this func. So when I do console.log func, okay, and I pass it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I can pass it as many things as I want. All you have to understand is it's going to take these 9 elements, it's going to convert them into an array because I'm using the rest operator, and because it's converted it into an array, are included in JavaScript for array objects, and then on filter, the way filter works is you take an element, pass it in, and check for what you want to filter by. So I've checked to see if my element equals 1. It's going to filter through all 9 of these, and it's only going to return it if it's equal to 1, which obviously only one of them is. So if I clear this and run, there we go, it prints 1, right? And if I did another one, it should print 3 ones, right? Because they match. Very good. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the rest operator. It's the same syntax as the spread operator. It just depends when you're using it, if it's inside of a function or if it's for properties and objects. The last thing that I want to talk to you guys about is, well, there's a couple of things, is destructuring, okay? Now, it sounds similar to what we just talked about, okay? But it allows you to easily extract array elements or object properties and store them in variables. When you first hear that, it might sound very similar to what the spread operator does, but it's different. So spread will take out all of the elements and properties and distribute them into a new array or an object or whatever you're using it. Destructuring allows you to pull out single elements or properties and store them in variables for arrays and objects. So let's take a look at this in live code. So let's say we have an array 1, 2, 3. Okay, and I want to pull out num1 and num2 from my numbers array. And I basically pulled out num1, num2. So if I want to console.log and run, there we go. I get 1 and 2 because I've stored them into num1 and num2. I've destructured these first two like that. Now, I can also do it like this. If I want to get num1 and num3, okay, I just have to add this extra comma here. So basically this represents the first element. This empty space in here represents this element, the second element. And then this third space here represents that. So now, if I want to get num1 and num3, and I run it, there we go, I get 1 and 3. So you can grab specific elements and pull them out, single elements and properties, and pull them out of your array. So that's what destructuring is, okay? So here you can see an example where destructuring this array of hello and max and storing them into A and B, the variables, and then I do console.log A and it prints out hello, console.log B prints out max. You can do the same thing on an object. So here I've got an object called name and it's got name max age 28 and I've stored the name into name. Obviously you have to use the same naming convention. So if this one's property is name, I have to use the same property here in my curly braces. And when I print out name, it gives me max. Obviously, I didn't store anything into age, so if I try to do console.log age, I get undefined. All right, so you have to be specific with your objects. Kind of similar to what we had earlier on with the exports and the imports. You have to be specific with the name that you're importing and exporting if you don't use that default keyword. All right, one of the last things, if you've coded in like C++ and used pointers, those, what I talked about up until now were most of the next gen JavaScript features that we're going to use in this course. Some of them we won't use super often, honestly. And the next few are features that you may have forgotten, but they're super important to remember. So reference and primitive types basically is the difference between when a variable makes a copy of something and when a variable is actually pointing to the original address in memory for where that thing exists. So you may have heard of pointers and references and all of those types of scary things. Basically, if you create a number or a string or something like that, we call that a primitive type. So here, for example, I've got const number equals 1. I created a second variable const num2 equals number. Well, num2, obviously, which is going to be set to this variable that I just made on the first line of number, is now going to be set to 1. So when I do console.log num2, I'll get the value of 1, but it makes a copy, okay? It makes a copy of the value of number 1. So it exists in two places, right? Obviously, number has an address in memory and it has the value of 1, but num2 has its own address in memory and copies that value, right? So it's duplicated it. Objects and arrays are different, okay? So objects and arrays are what's called reference types. They do not copy. They store a pointer in memory to the reference of the original object, okay? So here, I've got an object called person with a value for a property of name called max. Sorry, the property is called name. If I make const second person and I make another instance of the person, and then I set my person.name to Manu, all right, just like how if I were to update it here, you would expect here console.log.secondperson to still print out max, right? Because I didn't update second person. Second person was equal to person up here when person was still max. And then I updated person's name after I made the copy of it. But that's the thing. I didn't make a copy of it. If I change the name here for person, it also changes the name for second person because they point to the same address in memory. They point to the same object. If you think about it like this is an address in memory down here, and person is pointing to it, if I make a copy of person into second person, it's pointing to the same thing. They're pointing down to the same value. So if I update it here to person 1 in max, then person 2 will also get updated to max. And if you change it here, it changes it in both places. So if I update it to Manu and I print second person, it still will print Manu.
Does that not defeat the point of a const second person?
So think about this more like this is an object. So the object's name won't change, like person. It's still always going to be a person,
Okay.
but the name can change.
Property changes. Okay.
Yeah, you got it. The property. So I'm a person, and I'll always be a human. I can't change that, but I can go to the driver's license or whatever, and I can change my last name if I get married or something.
I see. Okay.
Right? Cool. Types, it's just important to know with objects and arrays that they're stored in memory and they don't make a copy of it. So if you update it in one place, it updates it in another place. Even if you think you've got two of them, they don't make copies the same way that strings and numbers do. So just important to keep in mind. This is the last thing I want to talk to you guys about today is refreshing array functions. So here I've got an array of numbers, okay? 1, 2, and 3. And then I made a function called double num array. And you don't have to worry about the .map function. The .map function is a JavaScript function that basically takes every number in it and passes it through and applies it to the logic within your function. So it's going to map 1 into here, then it's going to map 2 into here, and then it's going to map 3 into here. It kind of just loops through. So let's say I have a function that I want to double every single number, okay? Well, the map function is what will allow me to go through every single number that's passed into it if I do numbers.map. it's just a function that we can apply to an array. So numbers.map num is what I'm going to call each number that I want to loop through. And we can see here 1 double to 2, 2 double to 4, 3 double to 6 when I console.log. So just important for you to remember the .map function. You'll see that around throughout the course as we get into React. It's a really helpful one for looping through your arrays and applying whatever logic you want to apply within a function. So that is your JavaScript refresher. Hopefully you enjoyed it and that made you remember a little bit about JavaScript. If you've not done much JavaScript, don't be worried, don't be scared. We'll still take our time when we walk through building React yourself in the right headspace with how objects, classes, all of that works. And then we'll apply it next week when we build our first React web app. Cool?
Yes, thank you.
I'll end the recording here.